So welcome everyone to Resources and Programming for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Community. Just to go over some things, we will be going over introductions, what is deafness versus what is deaf as in culturally deaf, different ways to communicate and accommodate for deaf and hard of hearing people. And this part seems to be really long, and it's really important because you need to understand whom you are serving before you can come up with programs to serve. And then at the end, we'll have resources and open questions. So first one we have is Alicia. If you want to please introduce yourself.
Yes. Hello, my name is Alicia. I'm originally from a small town in East Texas known as Grapeland. It's Grapeland, all one word. Grapeland, one word, you say it in one breath. And it is a town with roughly around 1,500 people, give or take. Mostly it's kind of less than 1,500. So very small town surrounded by farmland, ranchland. It's kind of isolated, and there's just not a lot of good resources or opportunities in the area. It has one of the highest rates of unemployment, high rates of teen pregnancy, high rates of substance abuse, and there's just not a lot of well-paying jobs in the area. And so in that environment is where I learned roughly around junior high age that I had hearing loss. And I only was made aware of it when the school nurse gave us hearing tests and said that I completely failed the hearing test, but I could still hear sound. So I was really confused by her saying that I had failed the hearing test. And so they recommended that my parents take me to an audiologist. The first audiologist claimed that I was faking for attention because I was really anxious and confused about her instructions. My first time being in one of those big booths where they do the audiology exam, and just really nervous about the whole thing. And eventually they fired that audiologist and asked my parents to bring me back for a retest. And they said, yes, you did have hearing loss. And I was giving hearing aids. But I did not wear them for very long because all it did was amplify sound. And I realized that certain things I could not hear, like people talking in cars. All I could hear was road noise and not speech. But even then, I was still kind of in denial about the hearing loss well into college because I could still hear some things. But that whole time, I continued to be mainstreamed in public school and college without accommodations. I did not know until a few years ago that the school was legally required to do an IEP evaluation or some sort of evaluation to determine what my accommodations would have been. They never did that. And so I just basically adapted as well as I could. I always loved how to read. I always loved reading. And so that's really how I managed to continue to do well in school. I just did a lot of reading. And I also somehow taught myself how to read lips. And that's basically the only way I got through junior high and high school. When I went to college, I did not realize that I was really eligible for receiving, having a note taker or anything like that. I thought that you had to be completely deaf and not hear any sound, and I could still hear some sound. And nobody really explained anything about what the benefits were, about accommodations or anything. It was a lot of learned helplessness at that point, because prior to that, growing up in a small rural town, they did not do anything at all to help me at all. Eventually, I managed to get a PhD in criminal justice. Again, a lot of lip reading and just a lot of studying. I moved to Dallas with my now husband in 2019, and I received a cochlear implant in November of 2020. And I finally started learning ASL last year, but I still am not proficient in ASL. Again, growing up in a small rural area, nobody was communicating in ASL except for people who did ASL in church, signing to music and songs, but they themselves were not proficient in ASL. And so again, no real exposure to ASL, did not know where to learn, where to go to learn it. There's just no resources there. My library background, I was actually a student assistant at the college library. Again, my background was in criminal justice, but I decided to change careers to focus on librarianship because I really enjoyed. I briefly taught at a community college criminal justice classes, but I hated teaching in a formal classroom, giving tests and grades and things like that. And I remember my experience working at the university library where I was able to, how you learn skills without having to give tests and grade. So I'm like, this is a better fit for me. And so I started working at the Dallas Public Library in 2019 while I worked on my master's in library science. And I completed that degree in December of 2021. And my experience here in Dallas Public Library, I had started out working at the downtown Central Library on the 6th floor where they have social sciences, education, and job help specialization. But now I'm on the 4th floor where they have fine art, music, and movie specialization. And that's enough about me. Back to Kaycee.
Thank you. So my name is Kaycee. I was probably born hard of hearing. It wasn't until I was 4 years old that someone finally realized maybe we should take her to an audiologist. And they said, oh yeah, she is definitely hard of hearing, severely. And so if you're going to be hard of hearing or deaf in the 80s, the best place for that is in Alaska. I just happened to be living there at the time. The schools, most of the schools were in two different camps of thought. One was the oral school where they say, teach them to speak and to lip read. Lip reading is very difficult to learn. And so those kids tended to not fare very well. I think you now met and heard from one of those kids, Alicia. And then the other school of thought was the ASL sign language approach of like, since lip reading and speaking is so difficult, we'll just teach them sign language and then have interpreters throughout the world. Unfortunately, that didn't work out very well either. But my school combined both schools and said, let's do all three, lip reading, speech, and ASL to give the child all the possible options of getting through the world. So in 3rd grade, we moved from Alaska to Houston where there was no school at the time. And so then I was mainstreamed in, and that was really rough. Jumping way forward, well, not way, okay, way forward. In 2015, I received my first cochlear implant, my first and only cochlear implant. This past year, it got upgraded. So I feel like I have the BMWs of cochlear implants. They still aren't perfect, but it's pretty swanky with the Bluetooth technology and all of that. I went to Baylor University where I got my bachelor's in English and secondary education. I love teaching. Parents, not so much, and I didn't want to deal with them for the rest of my life. So I decided to go instead to University of North Texas, and I got a master's in library science. I never expected to be a public librarian. I started as a researcher for Fidelity Investments, the .com boom busted. And so I was going to temporarily spend a couple of years in public libraries and then move back out into as a researcher, nerdy geek type. But here we are 20 years later, and I'm still here. So in 2005 for Dallas, I started off as a little green assistant manager. I have worked in about 6 different branches, and let's see, first, second, and 5 of the 8 floors at the Central Library. So I've seen quite a bit. They finally put me at a pretty permanent basis at the Brauweiler Park Branch Library, and I am now the manager there. So that's us and our credentials, I guess you could say. So moving on, what is deafness? Deaf means someone with severe to profound hearing loss, which implies very little or no hearing. For me, I am definitely, legally, as one can call it, deaf in that I don't start hearing sound until I'm standing next to an ambulance with its sirens blaring, and that's only in my right ear, and it sounds like a whisper. They cannot measure my left ear. Surely there's a little bit left, but not much. Hard of hearing is someone with enough residual hearing to have auditory devices such as a hearing aid or FM system to provide adequate assistance to process speech. Hard of hearing is, I would say, more like the medium to severe hearing loss. They can hear, like Alicia said, they can hear sound, but it means that everything sounds garbled and muffled, and there's no real clarity. It's just the sensory parts of your ears has enough to say, acknowledge, oh, there's a noise. Now what that noise is, who knows? And then the other thing we have is late deafened. Hearing loss is the most likely disability that one will have later in life. And the population, I think last I checked, was like 60% of the population worldwide will have hearing loss of some sort as they age. So all of you get to become late deaf at some point in your life. Now, someone who becomes late deafened is someone who has been in the hearing world and functioned in the hearing world just fine with normal hearing, and for whatever reason, due to accident, illness, aging, their hearing goes down to the point where they become hard of hearing or even deaf. It's a little bit different because unlike Alicia and me, who we didn't have hearing to begin with, and we just sort of ran with it, and I guess you could say didn't know what we were missing. A late deafened, it's a little bit more, well, it actually is traumatic because you have something that you had and suddenly it is gone. And so a lot of compassion and understanding is needed for those with late deafened. Verbal versus nonverbal. This is about the 2 different schools that I was talking about. Deaf and hard of hearing people can be verbal in that they can speak well enough to be understood, or they're nonverbal in that they've never been taught how to use their voice or anything. And so basically in the deaf and hard of hearing world, we're a diverse group just when addressing our ears. So now, deaf as an identity, identity is someone who identifies themselves as culturally deaf and are heavily part of the deaf community. They do not view deaf as a disability and dislike being labeled as hard of hearing and such. Culture and consists of a group of individuals generally born and who communicate with American Sign Language. Deaf culture is both defined and bound by their deafness. And so kind of think of it this way. last I checked, about 75% of parents, hearing parents of deaf children and hard of hearing children don't actually learn sign. And this includes my parents and my extended family. And so when you have someone who has a disability that already starting with the family and going out, no one wants to address or accommodate except for, here's some hearing aids, now you're fixed, go for it. It makes you very isolated. So when, as deaf and hard of hearing people grow up and grow out into the community, meeting other deaf people is like, oh my gosh, we have the same experiences. We actually speak the same language. And so that's why deaf culture has been such a huge, as any demographic who experiences prejudice and insensitivity, it bonds deaf people together. And so that's why there's a whole deaf community for, art and literature and just potluck dinners. What the main thing that unites every deaf person in the deaf identity and culture aspect is ASL is the uniting thing, which is always exciting because in the hearing world, I get flack for being Asian, especially during COVID and any other identities. And but in the deaf world, they didn't care if I was Asian. They cared that I was deaf and that I signed. And I said, this is my wife. And they're like, is she deaf? And I was like, well, no, but she signs. And they said, close enough. There was no like having to explain myself in that. It was, you're deaf, you're one of us. So there's different kinds of communication that I wanted to go over that deaf and hard of hearing people use to communicate in the hearing world. One is lip reading. I consider this the worst one because lip reading is very difficult. It's also known as speech reading. It's a technique of understanding speech by visually interpreting the movements of the, lips, face, and tongue when normal sound is not available. It relies on information provided by the context, knowledge of language, and any residual hearing. Basically, it's a complete guessing game. Because of the English language, there's 44 different sounds that are made to make words in the English language. Only 22 of those sounds are perceivable by sight. Like if you think of pronouncing T and D, they look the same, t, duh. The only difference is how that feels. And then if you go even crazier, if you look at the sound B and M, bat, mat, it looks exactly the same. So that's why lip reading, most people who do lip read only understand about 30 to 40% of this. And the rest of comprehension is used with contextual clues within the words they know. Also the person's body language and face. So if they're talking about something happy, they're probably not going to be smiling saying it was the worst time of my life. So some words won't be used in that setting. So because of this, lip reading is a huge guessing game. So if you do have someone who's going to lip read, these are successful pointers on how to lip read. It depends on previous hearing and previous knowledge of the language before. Hearing devices like a cochlear implant or hearing aid, these things only amplify sound. They do not clean anything up. They definitely don't fix deafness. I don't stop being deaf just because I put my cochlear implant on. I'm just a deaf person with a cochlear implant. Also being able to interpret gestures and contextual clues. Now on the speaker side, you can help out by one, having good lighting on the speaker, direct bright light that creates a shadow across the face. It hinders everything. Also make sure everything is visible. When lip reading, you're not just looking at, lips. You got to make sure that lips, cheeks, throat, facial expressions are all visible. And so I have the crime of talking with my hands a lot. So if you are speaking for someone to lip read, make sure your hand talking goes down, that you're not talking up here and blocking the view of your face. Those of you who are more masculine prone and have facial hair, I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. So go ahead and get pen and paper and write out, be prepared to write a lot. We don't judge handwriting or grammar. We just want to know your latest gossip that you want to share with us and share it back with you. Also, speak in a clear and normal voice and pace. Anyone who has learned how to lip read has learned normal paced language. They have not learned, like baby talk video, high-pitched weirdness. And so you don't have to speak really slowly, but also please don't be a farm auctioneer. It's hard enough understanding at a normal pace, never mind wrapping it out as fast as you can. So also, instead of going up to someone and saying, do you lip read? Because that signals to people like me that the underlying message is, I'm really uncomfortable and I do not want to have to accommodate for you. So if you could just lip read, then that takes the pressure off of me, but then it puts the pressure back onto the deaf or hard of hearing person. And so instead of asking so bluntly, do you lip read lips or do you lip read? Ask them, what is the preferred method of communication? And then let the deaf or hard of hearing person say, oh, I lip read, no problem, or just hand you a piece of paper or hold up their electronic device to caption what you're saying. So next mode of communication is sign language. What is sign language? Sign language is a manual communication commonly used by people who are deaf. The gestures or symbols in sign language are organized in a linguistic way. Don't know if you know this, but there are many forms of sign language. To say sign language is a broader term. My first language is American Sign Language as opposed to signed English or cued speech. Like even within this country, there are different types of sign language. Sign language, each sign language is a complete language. It's not an interpretation of English or whatever language of the country. It has its complete grammar and idioms. And so don't think of sign language as, oh, well, I already know English, so I just need to know the gestures and then I'll be able to sign. To really sign properly with someone as to communicate in a language with anyone, you really need to know the grammatical structure and study that as well, not just go in a dictionary and start waving your hands. There's been a lot of discussion about whether sign language does or does not interfere with the development of English skills. I don't know if you all have been listening for a while, but sign language is my first language, and you can see how just devastating it has been for my English skills. Sign language actually gives a language sooner to children, whether deaf, hard of hearing, or hearing, so that they can start communicating sooner. And then English just gets added as a layer on top. And so they'll just do sign language and never speak again is pretty much a myth. So what sign language also provides is it takes away language deprivation. Like for me, I did not speak until I was 5. And so from 0 to 5, I had to figure out other ways to communicate any kind of needs or funny things that I had. And so with language deprivation, it's going to completely interfere in a person's development. And so, because, as we say, we want everybody to be literate in reading by 1st grade or 3rd grade. And so if you have this language deprivation all the way up to 5 and then keep going, that's why a lot of deaf and hard of hearing people, deaf people, on average read at a 5th grade level because of language deprivation. So also there's technology for video relay services. So I have one in my home so I can talk with my friends and gossip. And it's basically a phone, but it's with the camera so we can sign and not have to speak. So that is the overview of sign language and the benefits of sign language. So other ways of communicating is pen and paper or pencil and paper. I use this a lot, but it's quickly going by the wayside because we are living in the new millennium and technology has boomed. Live Transcribe app is, as far as I can tell, the best transcribing app that I have encountered. It's provided by Google. Google paired up with Gallaudet University, the deaf university in DC in our country. And they created an app that had enough artificial intelligence and comprehension to be really good at transcribing everything that is said. The only problem with Google Live Transcribe that I have with it is that it doesn't tell me who's speaking. It only says the words that are being said. So there's still a little issue of, okay, who's speaking now? I hope that wasn't my boss saying that. Okay, now who's speaking? But also it's not as good as it is. It's not 100% accurate. And so there are some snafus. InnoCaption app is an app that you can put on your phone. And basically, like we have our lovely cart person here, it's cart on a phone. When I make a phone call, I have an operator through the InnoCaption app texting everything that the person is saying to me. And then I can choose to text back and the cart operator will speak it back, or I can speak for myself. This is really good, especially for 911 calls. Now I can make 911 calls. Otter AI is another kind of live transcribe that's also competing. I think it's only available on iPhone. So other electronic devices that we have is Teletext. Teletext is basically live transcribe on a tablet on the desk. This is great for anyone who works in customer service and is deaf or hard of hearing. Now you don't need to pass the customer off onto other people to help them. If we can't understand them, they just speak into it and they are good to go. Ubi Duo is for anyone who is pre-verbal and they can type out the conversation and back and forth. And as you can see in the photograph, all typing is live and in real time. So if someone comes up to you with their phone or tablet, again, just like in lip reading, you want to make sure that you speak in a clear and normal paced voice. And but remember that the conversation is with the person, not the phone. So don't like speak at the phone and say, hey, how you doing? So did you hear that Susie went over to the other branch the other day? Continue to speak to the person. And that's for that. So when it comes to accommodations, Americans with Disabilities Act, it became federal law in 1990. This slide is just an official quote down of everything that you need to remember for the ADA Act when you are at work and thinking about programming, or even with your coworkers or employees. It's just one really big fancy way of saying reasonable accommodations, which is any modification or adjustment to a job or to work environment that will enable an applicant or employee with a disability to participate in the application process or to perform essential job functions. So basically in the previous slide, with all the new technology that we have, deaf people can actually do and provide customer service. So, but also when I have trainings and meetings with a bunch of other people, it's nice to have an interpreter or a cart available so that I can keep up and know what's going on. So accommodations that are covered under ADA, one is the big one would be an interpreter. So people who use sign language as their main means of communication, someone will be there to sign exactly what is being said and also point out and say, okay, this person is speaking now and this is what they're saying, but also to speak for the deaf or hard of hearing person if they choose not to speak. When there is an interpreter present, number one, don't panic. You can recognize them because they usually wear all black. So it's either an interpreter or they're on their way to a Gothic convention. Speak to the deaf or hard of hearing person, not the interpreter. Just treat the interpreter like it is the deaf or hard of hearing person's shadow. They are there to assist. They're not there to have the conversation with. Also, if the deaf or hard of hearing person chooses to sign back, don't listen to the interpreter. I mean, listen to the interpreter, but remain in eye contact with the deaf or hard of hearing person. Again, the interpreter is basically a shadow. They've been trained. They've got their chakras aligned, so their feelings won't get hurt if you ignore them and go for it. Also, hold any comments or questions you have for the interpreter until the end of the event. So when the interpreter arrives to the point of the end of the training or meeting or whatever, that interpreter is on call and they are there for the deaf person and needs to act like the deaf or hard of hearing person's shadow. So every conversation that can happen in that event, the interpreter needs to be there, be it the actual instruction time to break time when the deaf or hard of hearing person wants to meet up with their friends or co-worker that they haven't seen in a while and catch up on the latest gossip of who's at what branch now and all that stuff. That's what the interpreter is there for. So that's not the time to express your newfound love of how beautiful ASL is, or ask the interpreter, hey, how do I get classes? Or my hearing is going, do you know where I would get hearing aids? The interpreter doesn't know anyways. So make sure to wait until the end of the event, and then you can have your personal, meaningful conversations with the interpreter. There's also CART, which we have right now. CART is for those who need captioning services because they do not sign. Not everybody signs, and not everybody signs the same sign. I went to an event where I was in American Sign Language signer and the other person was English, signed English. So having an interpreter was not going to work out for that. So we had CART, which is Communication Access Real-Time Translation. You have a person, much like in a courtroom setting, typing out everything that is being said so that the deaf or hard of hearing person can know what's being said. When you are at these events, you will see either you see the CART window, or you will see a screen up at the front of the room, or the deaf or hard of hearing person will have a tablet or phone that is feeding all of that into. And so pretty much like interpreters, leave the CART operator alone so that they can use their ears to hear what's going on. So now, accommodations that you as librarians and library staff can do is that when there are events, make sure that the lighting is well lit, not spotlight. I know we are all theater lovers and love to be dramatic, but spotlight is not going to help in this arena. Also, noise. This sounds weird, but keeping things quiet and background noises to a minimum is very helpful, because with the cochlear implant and hearing aid, it's like your hearing is a radio that's not quite tuned to that station. So you can kind of hear a voice and you can kind of hear the background noise. So if you take that and raise it up, that's what a cochlear implant and hearing aid does, is it raises all of it. So you get more voice, but you still have more of that white noise that's also going. So in order to have I guess you could say, clear reception. Make sure that there are no background noises. Go tell the lawn crew that there's ice cream down the street and they should take a break because they've been working so hard. Whatever you got to do to make sure there's no background noises. So because of that, most deaf and hard of hearing people have some residual or existing hearing. Total deafness is extremely rare. So most deaf and hard of hearing people hear something. It may take you all the way up to an ambulance to hear it, but something is heard. And so noises are still distracting. And also loud noises, like it's kind of funny that I wear earplugs to concerts because I still have eardrums and they can still be ruptured. Speech, hearing aids and cochlear implants, again, amplify sound. So shouting does not help. It does not make anything clearer or easier to understand. You always want to keep in a normal paced speech and tone of voice. Just we're librarians, so you always want to remain calm anyways. So just keep calm and carry on. If someone asks you to repeat themselves, don't panic, do just that. And if they ask you again, consider going just a smidgen slower, but not a slog pace slower. And if they still don't understand, think about writing down like what the topic is or what the actual question is, or reducing your word lengths and simplifying the words to 1 or 2 syllable words. When it comes to seating, make sure that the space near the presentation is available. And so if there's a speaker at the front of the room, have some seats available for deaf and hard of hearing people to be at the front of the room, because either their captioning device needs to be next to the speaker in order to pick up what's being said, or if you're like me, I'm really short, so me in the back of the room, I can't see the interpreter. And also, if you have vision issues, the cart operator can type as much as they want, but if you can't see the screen, it's kind of a wasted effort. And that is pretty much everything that I have to show you on how to be a good how to understand deaf and hard of hearing people better, and also how to be accommodating for deaf and hard of hearing customers, coworkers, and whatnot. Now we get into the actual fun part. And so I will turn it over to Alicia.
All right, back to me. One of my roles here at the Central Library as being a program liaison, in which I am responsible for a lot of the programming. So I get to talk about, again, like Kaycee said, this is the fun part, programming. One thing to keep in mind is that programming for your deaf customers is not going to be that different from how you would create programming for your hearing customers. You need to be able to understand the needs and interests of that population within your community, and to know what gaps you would need to fill to address their needs. We have had programming for National Deaf History Month, and that is one way in which you could create programming. You can have it based around deaf culture and deaf history program. And there are many different observance months and dates, including National Deaf History Month. But for our programs that we had some trivia, so you can host games and trivia programs. One of the program that we hosted was a program for teenagers, the Helen Keller trivia that we created as a way to educate teenagers that Helen Keller was actually a real person who was still able to accomplish everything that she accomplished while being deafblind. A couple of years ago, there was a trend going on TikTok among teenagers where they were claiming that Helen Keller either was faking being deaf and blind, or she did not actually exist, because they could not understand how a deafblind person could accomplish everything that she had accomplished in her lifetime. So we created this program as a way to educate teenagers about Helen Keller and about the deafblind and deaf community. And so that's another way that you can engage actually different age groups, especially teenagers. You give them some prizes, and hopefully they learn something in the process. Another program that we've hosted, not with National Deaf History Month, but it's related to Texas history. One of the prominent figures within Texas history is Erastus Smith. He goes by Deaf Smith. That was a very popular thing back in the olden days, where if you were deaf, that became your nickname. You were known as Deaf Smith, or whatever your last name was. And so we had a speaker come who is deaf, and he's researched Erastus Smith's lifetime. He wrote books and everything, and he was a history professor. So he came and gave a presentation that coincided with the Texas Revolution. Other programs that we had going on at the time. So any kind of local, state, or national history regarding the deaf community, you can create programs based on that. Another program that we had during the National Deaf History Month programming was a tour. We at the time, we were doing these programs completely online. So we had the director of the Austin School for the Deaf. She came and she basically explained what they do there at the school. And she also had video and sort of gave a tour of the campus, what it looked like, and explained how the students got around campus and what their day-to-day was like, all of that. So you can host those kinds of programs. You can partner with a local agency or school and give tours to those locations. A popular program is ASL story times or readings. And we've had programs about that. We had, again, for the National Deaf History Month, a deaf ally. She's not deaf, but she's accepted within the deaf community as an ally. Nancy Chonin, she wrote a book about William Hoy, who was a deaf baseball player in the late 1800s. And that book was written for school-age children, elementary school-age children. And so she came and she did a reading for that. And we also had someone who, from the deaf community, again, a lot of the people in the deaf community, when there is someone famous who is deaf, they kind of latch on to them and they know everything about that person's life. And they like having, someone who represents us, that we can say that, wow, they were able to accomplish this too, someone that we could look up to. And so we also had a William Hoy expert who had a huge collection of William Hoy baseball memorabilia. He was also involved in the program and gave a lot of historical background about William Hoy. And so those are ideas that you can have with ASL story times and reading. ASL classes are also very popular. I will go into ASL classes a bit more later. You can also have programs about hearing health related programs. Again, I've learned that there's a greater incidence of hearing loss among teenagers because of earbuds. because the earbuds, they go directly into your ear. And if you play the sound for a long period of time at a high volume, it's causing people to lose their hearing, especially teenagers. So if you can have those kind of related programs to educate people about how to take care of their hearing. And this is a huge one that I think is very important in any library, but especially rural libraries, is having deaf community meetings and events to help bring the deaf community together. Because growing up in a rural county, in a rural town, I did not know any other deaf people. I may have seen a deaf person in a nursing home when I would volunteer and visit family, but they were late deafened and they did not know ASL. They did not know anything about deaf culture. And so, you know, for them, it's equally as confusing as it was for me, even as a kid, because they only recently lost their hearing. So I really did not have any deaf mentors. And so having deaf community meetings, advertising that, you know, you would bring the deaf community together, because there are other deaf people in these rural communities, you just do not know that they exist. And so it's a great opportunity for them to create a community and to have deaf mentors and be able to, you know, for children to have someone, an adult to look up to see this is how they adapted. This is how, you know, this is what they're able to accomplish, you know. And so I think those are really, really important. You can also have some passive programming. One of the more popular ones is having a reading list of books by deaf authors and deaf allies. And I specifically say deaf allies because there are some books written by hearing people that use deafness as a trope or as a metaphor, or they're just really badly written deaf characters. And I would not advise listing those on a reading list. And just be careful, kind of do your research whether or not the hearing author is accepted as a deaf ally within the community. And again, Nancy Chernin, let me write her name, and she is very widely accepted as a deaf ally. So anything written by her, she writes a lot of picture books. Another thing you can have is displays. You can have displays. One of the ideas that I was not able to get to do because COVID shut us down, I wanted to have a display of the hearing technology, different like the cochlear prototypes of cochlear implants, hearing aids, the caption phones, you know, there's the captioning tablets and things like that. Have a display of that, as well as the patent information, because on the 6th floor when COVID shut us down, they actually housed the patents. And so I was going to incorporate that. So you can incorporate the technology, different items, not just books, into a display. But that also does involve partnering with local agencies and the deaf community as well to donate things for that display. And you can also have crafts. This is a fun thing for kids, but anybody. You can have like coloring pages of the, you know, first school for the deaf that was established in 1817 in Connecticut. So they can color the page and they can learn something about deaf history at the same time. You know, coloring pages of famous deaf people like Helen Keller. You know, so you can get really creative with the crafts where you incorporate deaf history or deaf culture in with the craft. And so those are just different types. This is not an exhaustive list. You can get really creative with the types of programming. I will say that it is very important to include the deaf community when you are creating, implementing, and doing assessment of your programs and services. So hire deaf, hard of hearing staff and volunteers to lead and plan these programs. This is especially important for two reasons. One reason, especially when it comes to ASL classes, because there are a lot of hearing people who claim to be fluent in ASL when they're not really teaching ASL. They are teaching either something they made up, they are teaching the C sign that Kaycee mentioned. It's signed English, it's not ASL, and it or they're using the signs completely inappropriately, or not using it correctly. So you're having hearing people teaching either both deaf and other hearing people sign language. So if you have a deaf person, like a deaf kid like me, who's teaching from a hearing person sign language that's not correct, when I go into the deaf community, I'm not going to be understood, and I likely will not understand them. Same thing goes if you teach a hearing person something that's not correct sign language, they go into the deaf community, the deaf community is not going to understand them. So that is a huge issue in being sure that you use deaf teachers for teaching ASL. The second reason is because, again, deaf, there's a high portion of unemployed or underemployed within the deaf community. And so if you hire a hearing person, that is taking away opportunities from deaf people to be able to teach their own language. So again, as much as possible, hire someone who is deaf, a fluent ASL deaf user. If you're unable to find a local native ASL signer in your community, reach out to the State School for the Deaf. And it may be possible to host virtual ASL classes rather than in person if you have no other option to be able to accommodate the deaf teacher. Again, do not limit programs for the deaf just on topics of ASL or deaf culture and history. Deaf people, we are very diverse, and we enjoy a lot of different things, and we have interest in a lot of different things. And so we would enjoy participating and learning about a variety of topics, including crafting or learning how to repair your car or anything like that. Also ensure from the beginning that you create the programs to accommodate having captions available or ASL interpretation available. As much as possible, always remember to make them accessible. Our list of resources, these can help you with creating partnerships, with creating programs, with creating other services in your library. The first one is the National Association of the Deaf. It's a national organization in which that consists of primarily of deaf people, in which they advocate for the rights of the deaf. National Deaf Center, actually, it specifically seeks to improve continuing education and training for deaf people. They have webinars and other online learning opportunities. So that would be a great resource to create adult programming or programming for teenagers who are coming out of high school and want to go into college. And so they're a great resource for that. Then there's Gallaudet University. Kaycee already mentioned Gallaudet. It is the only liberal arts college in the world for deaf people. Their website, they have a lot of resources about the history of Gallaudet, and about some of this information that we had about literacy among the deaf. So they have those as a resource. They also publish their own books. So you can look at the publishing, what they publish, and you can add that into your collection. And they also have, again, a variety of different kinds of research that could be interesting and helpful in creating services and programs. The Office on Deaf and Hard of Hearing is located in Mississippi. It is a division of the Mississippi Department of Rehabilitation Services. They can help with locating an interpreter or CART services. And you could partner with this organization and feature them where they explain the services that they can provide to the deaf community. And you know, and so that would be a great program a great partnership with them. So they can let the deaf within that community know what services, resources are available to them. And then the library services for people with disabilities policy. This is an ALA policy for what services you should provide for people with disabilities within your library. Then the RUSA, the Reference and User Services Association, they have accessibility guidelines for a wide variety of disabilities, but they do have one specifically for the deaf and hard of hearing community, and you can go there for that. Then we have FOLDA, which is the Friends of Libraries for Deaf Action. It was actually founded by a retired deaf librarian, Alice Hagemeyer. And she is actually the one who created and advocated for National Deaf History Month. It started as a day, then a week of her and her deaf colleagues teaching ASL and about deaf history and deaf culture when she worked at the Washington, D.C. Public Library. And she continued to advocate to expand it into an entire month. And so she founded this website, and it has a lot of great resources that can help you in coming up with programs. There's a lot of information about deaf history, about deaf culture, about the various observation dates, and it's a great resource for programming. And the next resource that we have is Bridging Deaf Cultures, which is an ALA interest group. I happen to be the current chair. Again, Alice, she founded this interest group, and I took over the chair from her just this past August. And so we have an ALA Connect community. You do not have to be a member of ALA to sign up for access for the ALA Connect community. So if you want to connect with us, if you have any questions about anything, you can post in the ALA Connect community. And the QR code that I have on the slide actually takes you directly to the ALA Connect community for the interest group. So conclusions, always include the deaf community when creating, implementing, and evaluating programs and services that impact us. There's a very popular saying within the disability community, nothing about us without us. And again, it's just very important to ensure, if you want to be truly accessible and inclusive, you need to include someone within the deaf community when you create your programs and services. Next, do not make assumptions, just ask. Like there's some deaf people, they do not mind if you lightly touch them. However, I jump out of my skin if you touch me at all. And so instead of making assumptions that, okay, she's deaf, I can touch her, it's best to ask, because I prefer someone just walking into my field of vision and just, gently waving to get my attention. Do not touch me because it scares me. Um, and so, which that leads to the next thing, is that the deaf community is very diverse. Kaycee went over all the different, basically deaf types, in which we have different causes, in regards to what causes our deafness, the time in which we lose our hearing, if we ever had it, and again, the things that we are exposed to. Some deaf people, they are exposed to ASL very early on. Some deaf people only get exposure in ASL later in life, and some people, we never become fluent or get exposure to it at all. Oralism is more common simply because like 90% of deaf people, they come from hearing families, much like myself. And so we are predominantly exposed to speech and hearing, or the illusion that we hear, basically. And so there's a lot of deaf people who do not know ASL at all. And so again, that's where libraries come in to be able to give deaf people access to ASL when there is no other way that we would have access to that at all. And so keep in mind, just how diverse the deaf community is and how you can feel the various needs within the deaf community. And again, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay if your first thing you do is to tap me, and then, again, I jump out of my skin, but I will let you know at that point that I do not prefer that as a way of getting my attention, that I would prefer, again, that you walk within my field of sight and gently wave. But again, it's important to learn from these mistakes that you make. Again, because of the fact that we are so diverse in our needs and our interests. And I do strongly believe that rural libraries have a pivotal role in connecting the deaf community to each other, as well as connecting deaf and hearing communities to each other. It's especially important, as I mentioned, because a lot of this deaf people, we are born and raised in the hearing family. And so that really can actually bring families closer together, in which the families learn together ASL, deaf history, deaf culture. They expose their child to a deaf mentor that helps improve their self-esteem, their self-confidence, and it really strengthens the family itself. And so, again, rural communities are very isolated, and the libraries are, the one resource that these communities have, because there's usually hardly any kind of resources available, if any at all, where they can connect deaf people to each other and allow deaf people to learn about deaf history, deaf culture, and about ASL, and about the resources and services out there that are available to them. And so again, I applaud you for for being librarians within a rural community, because I understand how daunting it is, because libraries are, again, probably one resource that anybody has in that community. And so one of the things that I would recommend, because I know that rural communities are kind of spread apart. In where I'm from, there is one library. At the time, there was one library in the entire county, and we would go to that library. But we were also pretty close to the next county over, so we would also go to that library as well. So that is a great opportunity for rural libraries that are close to each other to partner with each other, to share resources and information. That way they can reach out to a broader audience, a broader population. And again, to share those resources, because I know that it's not always very funding and things like that are an issue. So it's a great opportunity to partner with each other, as well as to partner with other state and local agencies that provide resources and information to the community there. Kaycee, do you have any last words?
Sorry. Okay, can you hear me now? I can't, but anyways, so that's our presentation. And so for this part, I leave the floor open to anyone who has any questions. Just hop on, please turn your camera on if you have a question, and just feel free to ask.